The first thing I felt was the cold. It seeped into my bones the way it always did in the final moments of a life, that deep, bone-chilling cold that comes when your body has given up and your blood is no longer doing what it's supposed to do. I'd felt it once before, in my previous life, when my body was broken and my heart was empty and I was lying in the middle of the street with my eyes fixed on a sky I would never see again. I remembered the impact. The screech of tires. The weight of metal against my ribs. The feeling of flying, and then the feeling of falling, and then the feeling of nothing at all. I remembered waking up in the hospital, surrounded by tubes and machines and the sound of my own heart monitor beeping too slowly. I remembered the nurses' faces, professional but sad. I remembered the way my mother had looked at me when she finally deigned to visit. Irritated, inconvenienced, like I was a chore she'd forgotten to complete. And then I died. And then I woke up again. I blinked, and the fluorescent lights of the hospital room came into focus. The ceiling was white and cracked, the kind of ceiling you only see in buildings that haven't been renovated since the 1980s. The air smelled like antiseptic and stale coffee and something faintly sour that I couldn't quite place. I was in a hospital bed. There were tubes in my arms. A heart monitor beeped steadily at my bedside. The sheet was thin and rough against my fingers. I was alive. I was young. I was back. "Mom just forgot you were allergic to peanuts," a voice said. "It's not like she did it on purpose. Do you need her to kill herself to make you feel better?" I turned my head slowly, and there they were. My mother, Catherine, was standing at the foot of my bed, her face pale and tear-streaked. She was wearing a floral blouse and a pair of heels that were completely inappropriate for a hospital visit. Her makeup was smudged from crying, her hair was slightly disheveled, and she was clutching a wadded-up tissue like a prop in a performance. My sister, Lily, was standing beside her. She had her arm wrapped around our mother's shoulders, her expression a perfect mixture of protective and outraged. Her face was flushed, and she was practically vibrating with indignation. And there, in the corner, was my father, Robert. He was standing with his phone in his hand, scrolling through something on his screen. He hadn't looked up since I opened my eyes. I recognized the scene immediately. I'd lived it before. This was the day I'd woken up in the hospital after being admitted for anaphylaxis. I'd been rushed to the ER during my SAT exam, collapsed in the middle of the test, unable to breathe, my throat swelling shut because my mother had packed me a lunch that was covered in peanut oil. "Mom just forgot," she'd said over and over. She just forgot. She'd forgotten. Just like she'd forgotten to pay my school fees. Just like she'd forgotten to pick me up from practice. Just like she'd forgotten my birthday, my doctor's appointments, the fact that I existed. But I knew now that it wasn't forgetfulness. It was selective memory. A choice she made every single time. And in my previous life, I'd taken it. I'd accepted it. I'd swallowed my anger and my pain and my rage, and I'd let her win. Not this time. "Mom," Lily said, shaking her head at me like I was a disappointment. "She doesn't care about you. She's too busy being angry about the SAT." It was my turn to speak. I knew what I'd said in my previous life. I'd cried. I'd begged. I'd tried to explain how much it hurt, how much I'd wanted to take that test, how much I'd studied. But this time, I wasn't going to do that. I was going to do something different. I turned my head slowly, letting my gaze drift across the room. Then I looked at Lily, and I made my eyes go wide and blank. Where am I?" I asked, my voice small and trembling. "Who are you?" I don't remember anything." The room went silent. "What?" Lily's voice was sharp. "What are you talking about?" I blinked slowly, letting my confusion play out on my face. "My head hurts. Everything's fuzzy. I stopped, wincing as I pressed my hand to my forehead. "I can't remember. I don't know where I am." Catherine's crying stopped. She stared at me, her mouth slightly open, the tissue forgotten in her grip. "You don't remember?" she asked. "You don't remember the hospital? The peanut thing?" I shook my head slowly. "I don't remember anything." "Bullshit," Lily snapped. "She's faking it. She's just trying to get attention." But my mother's expression was changing. I could see it in her eyes, a flicker of hope. If I didn't remember what she'd done, she didn't have to feel guilty. She could rewrite the narrative. She could be the good mother again. I don't think she's faking, Catherine said slowly. I think she might actually be confused. I wanted to laugh. Of course she believed me. Of course she wanted to believe me. Because if I had amnesia, she could pretend everything was fine. But I didn't laugh. I just lay there, playing the part of the confused, lost girl who had no idea what had happened to her. And when my counselor, Mr. Harrison, showed up later that day to talk about my options for retaking the SAT, I let my mother take center stage. She's been through so much, Catherine said, her voice thick with false sympathy. Of course I want her to retake the SAT. I want her to have every opportunity. It was your fault she missed the first one, a classmate muttered. Catherine's face flushed. I made a mistake. I'm human. But I'm going to make it right. I'll sign whatever papers you need. Mr. Harrison looked at me. Is that what you want, Iris? I nodded slowly, my expression still vague and lost. I think so. I just want to feel like myself again. And so my mother signed the papers. In front of witnesses. With no way to take it back. I had my second chance. I just had to make sure I used it. The summer after my accident was the longest of my life. I spent most of it in my room, pretending to recover from my mysterious memory loss while my mother tiptoed around me like I was a bomb that might go off at any moment. She didn't know what to do with this new version of me, the version that didn't remember anything, that couldn't be guilt-tripped, that didn't react to her carefully crafted manipulations. She tried, of course. She was Catherine. She couldn't help herself. The first incident happened 3 weeks after I came home from the hospital. I came back from a walk around the block to find my bedroom door open and my mother standing in the middle of the room, surrounded by a pile of my belongings. My books were scattered across the floor. My clothes were pulled from the drawers and heaped on the bed. My backpack was empty, its contents dumped on the rug. What are you doing? I asked, keeping my voice neutral. Spring cleaning, she said brightly. You've been in the hospital so long, everything was getting so dusty. I thought I'd help you organize. I looked at the mess. My textbooks were in a pile by the door, including the SAT prep books I'd bought with my own savings from my part-time job. My clothes were everywhere. And my backpack, which I'd hidden in the back of my closet, was now empty. I see, I said. And the books by the door? I thought maybe you'd want to donate some of them. You're not going to need them, are you? She was testing me. She was trying to see if I'd react. In my previous life, I would have screamed. I would have cried. I would have begged her to leave my things alone. But in this life, I just smiled. I don't remember what they are, I said. I don't remember any of it. You're probably right. Donate them. Her expression flickered. She'd been expecting a fight, and I hadn't given her one. I could see the disappointment in her eyes. But she didn't push. She just patted my hand and said, "It's for the best, honey. You need to focus on getting better, not on school." And she left the room. I waited until I heard her footsteps on the stairs. Then I walked over to the pile of books by the door, picked up every single one, and put them back on my shelf. She hadn't donated them. She hadn't even touched them. It was a test, and I'd passed. I was learning to play her game. The second incident happened at dinner. My mother was a wonderful cook. She was genuinely talented, and she loved showing off her skills to friends and family. But she also had a very specific set of tastes, her own. She cooked what she liked. She cooked what Lily liked. And she never, ever cooked what I liked. That night, the table was covered in dishes I couldn't eat. The salad was drizzled in a dressing made with peanut oil. The main course was a stir-fry that had been cooked in the same wok as a peanut sauce. The dessert was brownies that had been made with peanut butter. Lily looked at the table and rolled her eyes. "Mom, you know she can't eat this." "Oh, I forgot," Catherine said, pressing her hand to her chest. "I'm sorry, honey. I'm just so busy these days, I can't keep track of everything. You can just pick around it, right? In my previous life, I would have picked around it. I would have eaten the plain rice and pretended I was fine. I would have swallowed my anger and my fear and my pain, and I would have let her win. But in this life, I just smiled. It's fine, I said. I'll make something for myself later. I stood up from the table, walked to the kitchen, and made myself a sandwich. I ate it alone at the counter, while my mother and sister sat at the dining table and pretended not to notice. It was a small victory, but it was mine. The third incident was more direct. It was a Thursday afternoon, and I needed money for my SAT prep class. The class was expensive, but Mr. Harrison had found a scholarship that would cover half the cost if I could pay the other half up front. I needed $300 by Friday. $300 that I didn't have. I walked into my mother's room that evening, my hands clasped behind my back, my expression as neutral as I could make it. Mom, I need to talk to you. She was sitting at her vanity, carefully applying her night cream. She didn't turn around. What is it, honey? I need $300. For my SAT prep class. Her hands paused on her face. The silence stretched out for a long moment. Then she went back to applying her cream. I don't think I have that kind of money right now. You did when Lily needed the same class last year. I remember, she said vaguely. It must have been a different time. We were better off then. I didn't say anything. I just stood there, waiting. I'm sorry, honey, she said finally. I wish I could help. But you'll just have to figure something out. I left the room without arguing. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just walked out, closed the door, and went back to my room. And I started planning. My mother's closest friend was Nancy. Nancy lived 2 houses down the street. She was the kind of woman who called herself a real talker and took pride in knowing everyone's business. Her hair was always perfectly dyed, her clothes were always perfectly coordinated, and her mouth was always running. The 2 women had been friends for years, but it wasn't a real friendship. It was a competition disguised as a friendship. Every conversation was a subtle one-upmanship. Who had the better car, the better house, the better husband, the better children? Lily was my mother's favorite topic. She loved bragging about Lily's grades, Lily's extracurriculars, Lily's popularity. She never mentioned me. I was the shame she pretended didn't exist. But Nancy had noticed. Nancy noticed everything. I waited until my mother announced that she was taking Lily on a weekend trip to New York. It's a mother-daughter bonding trip, she said, smiling at Lily like she was the sun. We'll go shopping, see a show, have a wonderful time. You'll have to stay home and study, my mother said to me. You can't afford to lose any more time. I nodded. Of course. The weekend they left, I walked to Nancy's house. Nancy opened the door, and her face flickered through 3 emotions in rapid succession. Surprise, curiosity, and then a little bit of pity. Iris, what are you doing here? I need your help, Nancy. Can I come in? She hesitated for just a moment. Then she stepped aside. The house smelled like lavender and potpourri. There were doilies on every surface and photographs in every frame. Nancy led me to her kitchen, where a kettle was already boiling, and she poured me a cup of tea. I don't think your mother would like me talking to you without her, she said carefully. I know. But I don't have anyone else. And then I told her everything. I told her about the peanut incident. I told her about the SAT. I told her about the books my mother had tried to throw away, the food she kept making that I couldn't eat. I told her about the money for my prep class, the money she wouldn't give me. I told her about the trip to New York, the trip I wasn't invited on. Nancy's face shifted as I talked. The pity faded, replaced by something sharper. Something angrier. She's treating you like this. Right in front of everyone. And she just expects you to take it. I don't know what else to do. Here. Nancy reached into her purse and pulled out a wad of cash. Take this. $500. Pay for your class. Pay for whatever else you need. I stared at the money in her hand. I can't. You can. And you will. She pushed the cash into my palm. I've been watching her for years. The way she talks about you, like you're invisible, like you don't even exist. I've been waiting for someone to say something. I just didn't realize it would be you. I blinked back the tears that were threatening to fall. Thank you, I whispered. I'll pay you back. Don't worry about it. Just use it to get out of that house as soon as you can. I did use the money. I paid for my SAT prep class. I bought new books. I started planning my escape. And that weekend, when my mother and Lily came back from New York, Catherine was furious. She'd heard from one of her other friends that Nancy had helped me, that I had told Nancy everything. She showed up in my room that night, her face flushed with anger. Did you go to Nancy's house? She demanded. Yes. What did you say to her? The truth. The truth. Her laugh was sharp and cutting. You told her you were the victim. You made me look like the bad guy. I just told her what happened. Don't you dare lie to me. She stepped into the room, her hands on her hips, her eyes blazing. I've done everything for you. Everything. And this is how you repay me. By humiliating me in front of my friends. I didn't. Shut up. She held up her hand, silencing me. I don't want to hear any more of your lies. You want to go to college? Fine. Go. But don't expect me to pay for it. I wasn't planning on asking. She stared at me for a long moment. I stared back. And then she turned and walked out of the room, slamming the door behind her. I sat in the silence for a long time. I didn't cry. I wasn't going to cry anymore. The next day, I applied for a scholarship. The day after that, I found a part-time job at a local bookstore. I started saving every penny. I also started watching. I noticed things I hadn't noticed before. The way my mother always remembered Lily's favorite foods, her favorite shows, her favorite subjects. The way she never forgot to pay for Lily's tutoring or Lily's extracurriculars or Lily's new clothes. She didn't have a bad memory. She had a selective one. A memory that worked exactly the way she wanted it to, remembering the things that mattered and conveniently forgetting the things that didn't. And I was one of the things she'd chosen to forget. But I wasn't going to let that happen anymore. I was going to make sure she remembered me. I was going to make sure she remembered me forever. The state academic competition was my first real test. I'd been studying for weeks, staying up late, waking up early, filling every spare moment with practice problems and flashcards. Mr. Harrison had encouraged me to enter. He said I had a real shot, that my scores in practice rounds had been among the highest he'd ever seen. I didn't believe him at first. I'd spent so many years being told I wasn't good enough that I'd started to believe it. But I signed up anyway. I paid the entry fee out of my bookshop earnings. I told no one. I didn't want my mother to know. She'd find a way to sabotage it. The competition was held at a university 3 towns over. I took the bus there and back, arriving early, sitting in the back row, keeping my head down and my focus sharp. I didn't win first place. But I won second. $500. A certificate. A letter of recognition that could go on my college applications. I held the check in my hands for a long time, staring at the numbers. $500. More money than I'd ever had at once. It wasn't a fortune. But it was a start. The dormitory application was the next step. Our high school had a small dormitory program for students who needed it. Students from broken homes, students with complicated family situations, students like me. I'd known about it for years, but I'd never had the courage to apply. I applied the same week I won the competition. The approval came 2 weeks later. I'd been accepted. I could move in at the end of the month. I didn't tell my mother until the day I was leaving. She came home from work to find me packing my bags. Her face went through a series of emotions, confusion, disbelief, and then a kind of cold anger. What do you think you're doing? I'm moving into the dorms. The dorms. She repeated the word like it was a curse. You're moving out. Without asking me. I don't need your permission. I'm old enough. You're not old enough for anything. I'm old enough to have a job. I'm old enough to pay for my own things. I'm old enough to decide where I want to live. She stepped closer, her eyes narrowing. This is about the money, isn't it? Because I didn't give you the $300. It's about a lot of things, Mom. But mostly it's about wanting to live somewhere I'm not a burden. You're not a burden. Yes, I am. I zipped up my bag and slung it over my shoulder. I've always been a burden. I just stopped pretending otherwise. I walked past her. She didn't try to stop me. The dormitory wasn't luxurious. It was a small room with a bed, a desk, and a wardrobe. The walls were painted a pale institutional beige. The windows faced the parking lot. It was the best room I'd ever had. I decorated it with pictures I'd cut out of magazines. I bought a small plant for the windowsill. I hung my certificate from the competition on the wall. It was mine. No one could take it away from me. I didn't hear from my mother for 3 weeks. I thought maybe she'd given up. Maybe she'd finally accepted that I was gone and was moving on with her life. I should have known better. The text came on a Friday evening. I was in my room, studying for an upcoming exam, when my phone buzzed on the desk. Your mother is in the hospital. She was in a car accident. You need to come home. I stared at the screen for a long moment. My mother's friend had sent it, not my mother. She was trying to guilt me into coming back. I closed the book and put on my shoes. The hospital was familiar. Too familiar. The same fluorescent lights. The same antiseptic smell. The same cold, empty waiting room where I'd sat so many times before. I found my mother in a private room, surrounded by family. Her leg was in a cast. Her arm was in a sling. Her face was pale, but her eyes were sharp and watchful. Lily was sitting at her bedside, holding her hand. When I walked in, she didn't even look up. Look who finally decided to show up, she said. I came as soon as I got the message. 3 weeks, my mother said weakly. 3 weeks without a word. I thought you'd forgotten about me. You asked me to leave. I didn't mean it. I was angry. But you knew that. You just wanted an excuse. I didn't say anything. What was there to say? She'd never believe me. She'd never believe anyone who didn't tell her what she wanted to hear. Your mother is going to need a lot of help, one of my aunts said. She's going to be stuck in this bed for a while. I nodded. I understand. Someone needs to take care of her. I can't. I said it quietly. I have school. I have exams. Exams. Lily laughed. She's in the hospital because she was thinking about you, and all you care about is your precious exams. Was she thinking about me when she made me move out? She didn't make you move out. You chose to leave. She did make me move out. She just didn't think I'd do it. I looked at my mother. She was watching me, her expression unreadable. I'll come visit, I said. But I can't stay. And I can't take care of you. You're a heartless child, my mother's sister said. Maybe. I turned to leave. But I'm a heartless child who's going to graduate. And I'm going to do it without anyone's help. The next time I saw my mother was at her house. She'd been released from the hospital and was recovering at home, supposedly bedridden and helpless. I knew it was a lie. I'd seen her moving around the house when she didn't know I was watching. I'd seen her standing in the kitchen, moving freely, when she thought she was alone. She wasn't injured. She was pretending. She was pretending to be hurt, pretending to be weak, pretending to need help. And she was doing it because she wanted me to come back. I decided to give her exactly what she wanted. The day of the accident, I showed up at the house with a gift. Lily opened the door. She'd gotten the same text I had, the one about the accident. She'd probably rushed home as soon as she'd heard. Finally, Lily said. Took you long enough. Where's Mom? In the living room. She's been waiting for you. I walked into the room and found my mother lying on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, her leg elevated on a pile of pillows. She looked pale and fragile, like a flower that might wilt at any moment. Iris, she said, her voice weak. Thank you for coming. I brought you something. I handed her the box I'd been holding. It was wrapped in shiny paper with a big red bow. She took it carefully, her expression softening. You didn't have to do that. I wanted to. She opened the box. Inside was a collection of plastic cockroaches, the kind you find in novelty shops, dark and shiny and disgustingly realistic. They exploded out of the box as soon as the lid came off, scattering across the blanket and onto the floor. My mother screamed. She scrambled out of the couch, practically leaping across the room, her injured leg forgotten. She was on her feet, hopping and flailing, completely upright and mobile. The room went silent. My mother's face went pale. She'd given herself away. She'd revealed that she wasn't injured at all, that she'd been faking the whole thing. Everyone was staring at her. Mom, Lily said slowly, you're not hurt. It's the adrenaline, my mother said quickly. I didn't even feel it. I'm not supposed to be standing. Mom, just stop. It's not working anymore. I picked up one of the plastic cockroaches and held it up to the light. Funny how you can stand when you're surprised. Almost like you've been faking it this whole time. How dare you? My mother's voice was shaking. I gave you everything. I gave you everything. I gave you 6 years of my life, taking care of you, and you couldn't even remember my name. Don't you speak to me like that. I don't have to speak to you at all. I turned to leave. I'm done. I was halfway down the street when my phone buzzed. It was the lawyer's office. The one I'd contacted 3 weeks ago, the one who was looking into my grandmother's will. They'd found something. A trust fund. A large one. $3 million, set aside by my grandmother when she died. A fund that my parents had kept secret from me, hidden away in a private account they were supposed to have given me access to years ago. The money was mine. It had always been mine. And my mother had been trying to keep it from me. I stared at the message for a long time. Then I smiled. The game was far from over. The news about the trust fund spread fast. Small towns are like that. Word travels whether you want it to or not, and everyone has an opinion. I heard through the grapevine that my mother had been telling anyone who would listen that I was a liar, a thief, a selfish brat who had turned against her own family for money. She didn't mention that the money was legally mine, that my grandmother had left it to me, that my parents had hidden it from me for years. But I didn't care what she said. I knew the truth. And soon, everyone else would know it too. The first thing I did was hire a lawyer. My grandmother had set up the trust for my education, and my parents had been skimming off it for years, taking money that was supposed to be mine, using it for their own expenses, for Lily's extracurriculars, for the trips they took without me. My lawyer sent them a letter. A formal legal notice demanding full accounting of the trust fund and repayment of any funds that had been improperly withdrawn. My mother's response was predictable. She showed up at my school the next day, crying and wailing, playing the part of the wounded mother. She told anyone who would listen that I was destroying the family, that I'd been brainwashed by my grandmother, that I didn't care about anyone but myself. What kind of daughter sues her own mother? She wept. What kind of daughter would do something so cruel? The other students stared. Some of them whispered. A few of them believed her. I didn't care. I'd learned that the only person I could count on was myself. And I was determined to prove it. Lily, predictably, had her own version of the story. She'd been posting on social media for years, curating the perfect image of the devoted daughter, the loving sister, the shining star of the family. The posts showed her and my mother laughing together, hugging, sharing secret smiles. There were no posts about me. I wasn't part of her carefully constructed narrative. I was the inconvenient truth she tried to hide. But now that the truth was coming out, she had to adapt. She started posting about my cruelty and ingratitude. About how I'd turned against the family for money. About how I was a spoiled, ungrateful brat who didn't appreciate everything my mother had done for me. The posts got thousands of likes. Hundreds of comments. People were outraged on her behalf. Then she went a step further. One night, I got a text from a number I didn't recognize. It was a screenshot of a post, with a picture of me and my phone number. Wanted. Willing to meet up. Text me. My blood ran cold. I scrolled through the comments. They were disgusting, men offering to pay for time with me, to meet me at hotels, to have some fun. My phone started buzzing with unknown numbers. Messages from strangers. Photos I didn't want to see. Lily had posted my picture and my phone number on a hookup site. She'd pretended to be me. I stared at the screen. My hands were shaking. My vision was blurry. This was a new low. This was beyond anything I'd ever imagined she'd do. I took a deep breath. Then I called the police. The detective who arrived at my school was a middle-aged woman with tired eyes and a patient voice. She listened to my story without interruption, then asked a few questions. Did she do this before? Post pictures of you without permission? She posted my number on a hookup site. I have proof. I showed her the screenshots. She scrolled through them, her expression unchanged. Do you want to press charges? Yes. The arrest happened a few days later. The police showed up at the house while Lily was in the middle of a live stream. She was in the middle of telling her audience about how cruel I was, how selfish I was, how I'd destroyed the family. The doorbell rang. She opened it. There was a detective standing on the porch, with a warrant. They took her away in handcuffs. Her viewers got to watch. Her followers got to see it all. The comments on her posts changed overnight. The sympathy vanished, replaced by outrage. People who had believed her were furious. People who had defended her were ashamed. The attention she'd been seeking had finally arrived, but it wasn't the kind she'd wanted. My mother didn't come to my defense. She didn't apologize for Lily's actions. She didn't even acknowledge that anything had happened. Instead, she called me into her kitchen and tried to explain why Lily had done it. She was just upset, Catherine said. You'd been so cruel to her, so cold. She was lashing out. She didn't mean any harm. She posted my number on a hookup site. She tried to get me assaulted. She didn't try to get you assaulted. She just wanted to. To what? To ruin my life. To make sure I couldn't be safe. My mother waved her hand dismissively. It wasn't that serious. It was just a prank that went too far. A prank? Yes. A prank. You're overreacting. I looked at her for a long moment. You think this was a prank? I think you need to calm down and think about what you're doing. You're destroying your sister's life over a silly mistake. It's not worth it. You're right, Mom. It's not worth it. I turned and walked out of the kitchen. It was time to file charges. Lily spent a week in detention. The charges were ultimately dropped, but the damage was done. Her reputation was ruined. Her followers had abandoned her. She was suspended from school and had to transfer to a different district. My mother was furious with me. She called me selfish, cruel, unreasonable. She told me that I'd destroyed the family. She told me that I was just like my grandmother. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I just watched her and waited. Because I knew that her anger was just the beginning. She was just getting started. The next attack came through the family. My mother had always been good at playing the victim. It was her specialty. She could make herself the martyr in any situation, and she loved nothing more than to use that skill to get what she wanted. When she started telling everyone that I'd stolen from my grandmother, that I was using my grandmother's money to ruin the family, people believed her. It was easier than facing the truth. My aunts and uncles started calling me. My cousins sent me angry texts. Friends I'd known since childhood stopped speaking to me. I was alone again. But this time, I was used to it. My father, Robert, was the only one who seemed to care. He'd always been distant, his work and his phone his constant companions. He'd never fought for me, never defended me, never showed up for me. But I think, deep down, a part of him had always known that something was wrong. Your mother is upset, he told me one evening. She's acting out. But she loves you, even if she doesn't show it well. She doesn't show it at all. She's not perfect. She's made mistakes. But she's your mother. So was my grandmother. And she treated me better than you two ever did. He flinched at that. He tried to hide it, but I saw it. Why are you doing this, Iris? He asked. Why are you trying to tear the family apart? I'm not trying to tear the family apart. I'm trying to survive. I haven't spoken to my father in 2 years. I don't know if I'll ever speak to him again. Life moved on, slowly, painfully. I finished school. I got into a good university with the help of my grandmother's trust fund, the fund that my parents had tried to hide from me. I moved away, started a new life, and learned that there was more to the world than the small town I'd grown up in. I didn't tell anyone about my past. I didn't need to. But sometimes, late at night, I'd think about my mother and my sister. I'd think about the way they'd treated me, the way they'd blamed me for everything. I'd think about the things they'd done. And I'd remember why I'd left. Sometimes I wondered if they'd changed. If they'd learned from their mistakes. If they'd ever understood the damage they'd done. The answer, I learned, was no. I heard from a mutual friend that my mother had started drinking. She'd lost her job, lost her friends, lost everything she'd valued. The social media posts stopped appearing. The phone calls to the family faded into silence. Lily transferred schools again. The charges had been dropped, but the stigma remained. She stopped posting. She stopped showing up. She disappeared into the background. They were gone. They were no longer part of my life. And I was free. I stood on my balcony one night, looking out at the city lights. My heart was heavy, but it wasn't broken. I'd survived. I'd fought back. I'd won. And I'd done it without them. Maybe that was the real victory. Maybe it always had been. College was supposed to be my escape. I'd worked so hard to get there. I'd studied through every sleepless night, fought through every setback, survived every attack my mother and sister had thrown at me. I'd earned my place at this university fair and square, and I told myself that once I got there everything would change. And it did. I made friends. Real friends. People who didn't know my past, who didn't have any preconceived notions about who I was or what I'd done. They liked me for me, not for the stories my mother had told about me. I met someone. His name was Evan, and he was kind and patient and funny. He didn't push me to talk about things I wasn't ready to talk about. He just let me be myself. I started to heal. It wasn't easy. Some nights, the memories came back. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, convinced I was still in that house, still trapped in that room, still being told I was worthless. But the nightmares got less frequent as time went on. The fear got quieter. I was building a new life. A life I'd chosen. A life that belonged to me. And then they showed up. I was walking across campus when I saw them. My mother and sister were standing by the main gate, surrounded by a crowd of curious students. Catherine was wearing a dress that was too fancy for a weekday morning, and she was crying, real tears this time, or at least convincing ones. Lily was beside her, her arm wrapped around our mother's shoulders, her face a mask of wounded innocence. Iris! Catherine called out when she saw me. Iris, please, just give me a minute. The crowd turned to look at me. I felt the weight of their stares, heard the whispers starting up around me. I could have run. I should have run. But I was tired of running. I was tired of letting them control my life. I walked toward them. What are you doing here? I asked, keeping my voice calm and even. I came to see you, Catherine said, her voice trembling. I came to tell you that I'm sorry. For everything. I know I made mistakes. I know I hurt you. But I'm still your mother, and I love you, and I just want to make things right. She stepped forward, her arms open, like she was expecting me to fall into them. I didn't move. You're not here to apologize, I said. You're here to make a scene. To humiliate me. To pretend like you're the victim and I'm the cruel, heartless daughter who abandoned her family. That's not true. Every time you've done something wrong, you've come to my school. Every time you've wanted to get your way, you've done it in front of other people. You need an audience, Mom. You always have. The crowd was growing. More students were gathering, phones out, recording everything. I could hear the whispers getting louder. Is that her mother? I heard she disowned her family. Her sister's a convicted criminal. Catherine's face went pale. She'd heard the whispers too. You think you're so clever, Lily spat, stepping forward. You think you're better than us. But you're not. You're just a cold, selfish, heartless. Lily. I held up my hand. Don't. She ignored me. You stole from our mother. You stole from our grandmother. You ruined our lives, and now you're pretending to be the victim. Careful, I said quietly. Or what? You'll sue me again. She laughed. You think you can just go around treating people however you want? No. I pulled out my phone. I'd been recording for the last 30 seconds, ever since I saw them at the gate. I lifted it up so the crowd could see it. You're trying to humiliate me. You've been doing it your whole life. And I'm not going to let you do it anymore. I played the video. The audio was clear, even through the phone's tiny speaker. You think you're better than us. But you're not. You're just a cold, selfish, heartless. Lily's own voice echoed across the courtyard. The crowd's whispers turned into shocked gasps. Catherine stared at me, her face unreadable. I couldn't tell if she was surprised, impressed, or furious. Maybe she was all three. I'm not going to let you control me anymore, I said. I'm not going to be the villain in your story. I know who I am. I know what I've survived. And I'm not going to let you take that away from me. The crowd dispersed slowly, reluctantly. The videos had been shared already. They were spreading across social media, collecting likes and comments and shares. My mother's carefully constructed story was crumbling. She tried to fight back. She tried to tell the family that the video was doctored, that I'd manipulated the audio, that I was lying. But no one believed her. The evidence was too clear. My father called me that night. He didn't apologize. He didn't defend me. He just asked, "Are you happy now?" Happy? I repeated. I don't know. I'm free. Is that the same thing? You ruined your mother's reputation. She ruined it herself. I don't know why you're so angry, Iris. She's not perfect. She made mistakes. But she's still your mother. Tell her to stop making mistakes, then. Tell her to stop pretending she's the victim. Tell her to stop trying to destroy me. He was silent for a long moment. I can't do that, he finally said. She's my wife. And I'm your daughter. But that never mattered to you. I hung up the phone. I didn't cry. I was past crying. I sat in the dark for a long time, staring at the ceiling, trying to understand how I felt. I'd won. I'd finally won. I'd beaten them at their own game. I'd exposed them for what they were. And yet, I felt emptier than I'd ever felt before. Maybe because winning had cost me so much. Maybe because I'd been fighting for so long that I didn't know what to do with peace. Or maybe because I'd known the truth all along, that I'd been fighting a war I could never really win. That I'd been trying to get love from people who were incapable of giving it. I closed my eyes. I let myself grieve. I didn't stop moving forward. I finished my degree. I started my career. I built a life that was my own. And in the end, I realized something. Something that my mother and sister would never understand. I didn't need them. I never had. I'd made my own way. I'd built my own happiness. I'd created a life that was full and rich and meaningful, without their help and without their approval. That was the victory that mattered. Not revenge. Not punishment. Just freedom. I don't know what happened to my mother and sister after that day. I didn't keep track. I didn't want to know. Sometimes, I'd hear rumors. Someone would mention them in passing, a friend of a friend, a relative at a family gathering. I'd listen politely and then change the subject. They weren't part of my life anymore. They'd never been part of my life in the way that mattered. My grandmother had been right. She'd seen it years ago, when I was just a child. She'd left me the money, the love, the promise of a future. She'd given me everything. And I'd made it my own. On my 25th birthday, I visited her grave. I brought flowers, white roses, her favorite. I sat on the grass beside the headstone and told her everything that had happened. The school. The money. The years of fighting. The peace I'd finally found. I made it, I whispered. Just like you said I would. The wind rustled through the trees. The sun was warm on my face. I smiled. And for the first time in my life, I felt truly, completely at peace. The trial was quick. The evidence was overwhelming, the videos I'd recorded, the messages I'd saved, the testimony of the two men who'd been hired to marry me. My mother and sister had been caught red-handed, and there was no way to spin it, no way to pretend it was anything other than what it was. Catherine and Lily were convicted of kidnapping and conspiracy to commit human trafficking. The judge sentenced them to 3 years each, with no possibility of parole for the first 18 months. They were led away in handcuffs. They didn't look back at me. I didn't expect them to. I walked out of the courtroom alone. The sun was bright and warm on my face. I was free. The house went to me. My grandmother's house, the one my mother had taken over after her death, was mine by law. I sold it within the month. I needed the money, yes, but more than that, I needed to let it go. I kept a few things. A photograph of my grandmother. A quilt she'd made with her own hands. A book of poetry she'd read to me when I was small. Everything else I sold or donated. I didn't want anything that reminded me of the years I'd spent there, feeling small and unloved. I moved to a new city, a city where no one knew my name, where I could start over. I thought about them sometimes. I couldn't help it. They'd been such a huge part of my life for so long, and even though I'd moved on, they were still there, in the back of my mind, waiting to be remembered. But I didn't let it consume me. I didn't let it destroy the life I was building. I made friends. I found a job I actually liked. I fell in love. Evan and I had met a few months after the trial. He was warm and patient and kind, and he never asked for more than I was ready to give. He knew about my past, I'd told him, eventually, but he never judged me for it. He never tried to fix me. He just held my hand and reminded me that I was safe. 3 years passed. I was sitting in my apartment, reading a book, when the news broke. I'd been following the story for a few months, a series of robberies in the area where my mother and sister had been living, targeting women who had been released from prison. There were reports of violence, of stalking, of escalating threats. I didn't think it had anything to do with me. I was wrong. The call came from an old neighbor. "Iris, have you seen the news?" "No. What happened?" "It's your mother. And your sister. They're dead." I felt the words hit me like a physical blow. I sat down on the floor, the phone pressed to my ear, trying to process what I'd just been told. "They were attacked," the neighbor said. "The same people who've been robbing the area. They were walking home from the store, and..." I didn't need to hear the rest. I knew enough. I hung up the phone and sat in the silence, staring at the wall. I should have felt something, sadness, relief, anger, but all I felt was a strange, hollow emptiness. They were gone. After everything they'd done, after all the pain they'd caused, they were gone. And I was still here. I went to the funeral. I didn't want to go. I didn't owe them anything. But I felt like I needed to see it, needed to prove to myself that it was really over. The service was small. There were only a handful of people there, a few relatives, a few neighbors, no one who'd really known them. I sat in the back, watching. I didn't speak. I didn't cry. I just sat there, waiting for the service to end. After the ceremony, I walked to the gravesite. I stood there for a long time, looking at the headstones. "You're finally free," I whispered. "I guess that's the only peace you'll ever find." The years that followed were quiet. I didn't think about them as often. The memories faded, like watercolors left in the sun. I started to feel like myself again, the person I could have been if I hadn't been so busy trying to survive. I got married. Evan and I had a small ceremony, just a handful of close friends. No family. I didn't need them there. I had a child, a girl. I held her in my arms and looked into her tiny face, and I promised myself that I would be everything my mother had never been. I would love her unconditionally. I would protect her. I would never, ever make her feel like she wasn't enough. Sometimes, late at night, I think about my grandmother. I think about the way she used to hold me, the way she used to tell me that I was special, that I could be anything I wanted to be. I think about the house she'd left me, the trust fund she'd set up, the love she'd given me that my mother had tried to steal. Thank you, I whisper into the dark. Thank you for believing in me. I don't know if she can hear me. I don't know if there's anything out there listening. But I like to think that she can. I like to think that she's proud of me. I'll never forgive them. I'll never forget what they did. I'll never be able to think about them without feeling a dull ache in my chest, a reminder of all the years I spent trying to be loved and failing. But I've moved on. I've built a life that's mine, a life that I chose, a life that's full of joy and love and meaning. And in the end, that's the only victory that matters. I'm happy. I'm whole. I'm free. And I'm never going back.